First, thank you to Monsignor for hosting me. Thank you to Professor Farrell and to Lauren for organizing. Thank you to Marty for chairing the session. And thank you to Ricardo for giving me your spot. I feel really badly about that. And thank you to Jennifer for doing a PowerPoint slide, because as you'll see here, I also have a PowerPoint slide. I know I'm the only thing that stands between us and dinner. So I've tried to make this as engaging as possible. If you click on the link there, if you're in the Zoom, there are some interactive features of this presentation if you care to look. Otherwise, I will circulate it with the group later, so you can see some of the research tools, applied research tools that I'll be talking about today. Okay, I have to begin by apologizing for yet another talk on the United States. It's been great to hear from so many of our international colleagues today. But unfortunately, most of my research today will focus exclusively on the United States, which, as so many other people have mentioned, has become rather polarized. The paper linked at the bottom of the page here uncovered what we think is a landmark in public opinion, which is about 5 years ago. Animus towards the other political party outpaced appreciation for one's own party, kind of setting off alarm bells that this isn't even just about issues anymore, like so many other people have already argued. This is about identities and so on. One of the issues that is commonly blamed for creating this kind of animus or inter-party affective polarization, sometimes it's called, are so-called social media echo chambers. So here we're looking at Twitter and we're looking at US politicians. The red circles are Republicans, the blue circles are Democrats, and the lines between them indicate that they follow each other on Twitter. If we look at politicians, we see strong evidence that Republicans only connect with Republicans, Democrats only connect with Democrats. And if we look at other categories such as journalists or activists, if my app will load here, you would see the same pattern, that we tend to only connect with people who share our views. So about 5 years ago, I founded this polarization lab at Duke University, and our mission is to identify new ways to both do research on political polarization, but also to create new applied technology to empower individuals to really counter polarization themselves. And one of the ways that we thought was a very intuitive place to start, we've heard a little bit today, especially in Jennifer's talk, about echo chambers. And as I was just mentioning, regardless of whether we look at Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Clubhouse or whatever people use, there's a real pervasive concern that because we only follow people like us, it may be more difficult to develop the type of empathy that Anna was talking about this morning, or that Lee was talking about this morning. And so an obvious question thus arises, why not break ourselves out of our echo chambers in order to connect across political divides? And so here's a kind of a visual example of what might happen if we did that. You can see here the iconography is the elephant is the Republicans, of course, and the donkey is the Democrats. And once we remove our partisan identities, perhaps a lot of social science theory suggests we could connect on an individual level, and we would not need to throw up our defenses, the type of defenses that tend to persuade us, prevent us from persuading each other. And so in 2017, I led a large field experiment where we conducted a massive experiment in the real world on Twitter. We recruited about 1,200 Republicans and Democrats who use Twitter, the social media site Twitter, and we gave them a long survey to measure their views about a number of issues ranging from climate change to inequality to racial discrimination and so on. And we were able to use these data to create a measure of their kind of policy beliefs. Then roughly 1 week after we measured their opinions, we offered half of them money to follow an automated Twitter account or bot. So typically when we think about bots, we think about spreading misinformation and causing problems. But in our lab, we've tried to put forth the idea that bots can be useful for social research as well. And in this case, people were told that they would follow a bot that would retweet 24 messages a day, but they weren't told what type of content the bot would tweet. Gradually, we began to tweet pictures of nature landscapes, beautiful pictures of Italy mostly. And then gradually we turned up the dial of messages from the opposing political party. So for 1 month, Democrats saw one tweet every hour from a prominent Republican, either an elected official, a journalist, or some other kind of pundit. And the Republicans saw Democrats once an hour. We compared these people to people who hadn't followed the bot, and we looked at whose attitudes changed the most over the month-long period in order to try to begin to answer the question, what would happen if we took people outside their echo chambers? The theory, of course, is that, in line with a lot of the work, some of the work we've been talking about today, is that this type of dialogue would produce moderation. It would make people more able to connect with each other, to realize that there are, say, two sides to every story, and that there's an important middle ground. Unfortunately, what we found, I'll just, in the sake of brevity, I'll skip over some of the methodological details. What we found is that no one became more moderate when we paid them to step outside of their echo chamber. So in this graph here, you'll see we have the effects for Democrats and the effects for Republicans in the US. And these are people who followed our bots with different levels of diligence. So some who just followed them, but we don't know whether they paid attention to them. Others who were able to answer very detailed questions about the bot's content. And these are what we call fully compliant respondents. And so what we had hoped to see is that Democrats would become slightly more conservative when they began to interact with elected officials, journalists, media organizations, advocacy groups from the Republican side. We had also hoped to see that Republicans would become more liberal, moving this way on our continuum from liberal. Here in the US, of course, US context, liberal refers to more Democrat, and more conservative refers to more Republican. And once again, we see that Republicans became substantially more, quite a bit more conservative when they followed Democrats. In fact, through a back of the envelope calculation, the size of this effect is comparable to the overall increase in polarization in about 10 years of American history. So quite a huge effect just through 1 month of following the other side on social media. So for a group of people who had set out to decrease polarization on social media, this is very bad news. And we spent a lot of time using the latest tools of data science. We are a group of social scientists, statisticians, and computer scientists. We used the fanciest machine learning models you can imagine to try to make sense of these data. And to be frank and brutally honest, we couldn't figure it out. And so what we did about a year later is we repeated the entire experiment, except this time, instead of doing a quantitative analysis where we used survey data and this experiment to try to see what happens when you take someone outside your echo chamber, we interviewed them for several hours before and after they followed the bots. We were also able to collect a very large amount of data about their behavior on Twitter, link that to offline data, including data from our surveys and our interviews, and also get a really detailed picture of how their connections on social media changed over time during the experiment. If I had more time, I would tell you some long stories about individuals in our study. And in a book that I recently published called Breaking the Social Media Prism, I give about 12 narratives of people who experienced this in a detailed story of why we think this happened. But to cut to the point, we discovered in this follow-up qualitative research where we actually talked to people and got to see, meet them where they're at, hear about their childhoods, how they first learned about politics, what they do when they see an opposing partisan online. We discovered that the process is actually most similar to something that Marcelo, you were saying earlier today, this notion of social learning, or Jean Piaget, and the tendency of us all to, from childhood, to conduct kind of mini experiments on our social environment. So when we step outside our echo chamber, we might like to think that we are engaging in a better competition of ideas. We see a greater diversity of ideas, and almost by necessity, we see that because there's different ideas, maybe our ideas aren't correct. This assumes that the primary motivation of social media users is to share information or even to try to persuade each other. And what we've learned in our research, we think, is that the primary motivation of most social media users is not knowledge or truth, to stay in line with the theme of today, but status. And so if you think about social media and what motivates our behavior, it's an attempt to get other people to like us, which is quite substantively different than I think the type of deliberation that Jane was talking about that can be cultivated in an in-person setting. And so the really important question, I thought, as I began to step back and try to make sense of this research, is how is social media changing the process of social learning? So we've talked about, Monsignor talked about what makes us uniquely human and our ability to engage in politics. Yeah, I would say also our ability to create identities is what distinguishes us from, the animal kingdom. And so if we think about the social context, our ability to read the judgments of others, we typically try on different identities, we read the reactions of others, and we tend to enact those identities that give us a sense of acceptance or social status. I think all of us do this consciously or unconsciously, and of course there's 100 years of research going back to some of the research that's been mentioned already that would kind of dovetail with this idea of social learning. The very interesting question, I think, is how is social media changing the process through which we create our identities? Given that we know that identities are so central to polarization and all manner of issues that have come up today, how is social media changing this process? And I think it does it in at least two major ways. The first is that we have unprecedented flexibility to experiment upon our identities. Online, I can be virtually anyone. I can share every detail about my life, or I could pretend to be someone completely different. So one, I can experiment. I can try on a different menu of identities, if you like. Second, I have powerful, though ultimately very inaccurate, new tools to monitor what other people think of me. I have like counts and follower counts and engagement metrics and analytics. And all of these provide social media users with a sense of whether the person that they are projecting themselves to be on social media is resonating with other people. Now, of course, this is a very distorted set of incentives. When we think about the landscape of political discussions on social media, what we discover is that the vast majority of people who are engaging in political discussions, about 76% of all mentions of politics on Twitter, for example, are created by just 6% of Twitter users. And those 6% of Twitter users have disproportionately extreme views. Why is this important? It's important because it gives us the impression that everyone on the other side is extreme and unreasonable, a phenomenon that social scientists often call false polarization. And so my worry and concern is that social media has set the process of false polarization, our tendency to exaggerate the extremity of the other side, and also, by the way, minimize the extremity of our own side, kind of into hyperdrive. So we've given incentives for status-seeking extremists to cultivate followings, largely by engaging in increasingly extreme behavior over time. And in my book, I discuss a lot of cases of people who are really social outcasts and find a kind of membership online, engaging in political extremism. And I worry in particular that these are some of the same types of people who wound up storming the Capitol at the US not so long ago. Okay, so to wrap up, because I know we want to all get to dinner and wrap up our discussion, I also want to offer, in addition to this research, some applied tools. I think, tomorrow, I think we're turning, or you all, I wish I could join you. I have to return to Duke to teach, but you'll be talking about solutions, I understand. And so I'd like to offer some solutions, some tentative solutions, both from the bottom up and the top down. So one thing we've done in our polarization lab is to develop plug-in tools that individuals can use to understand how their own behavior contributes to polarization at scale. So for example, if you have a Twitter account, you can put your Twitter handle in this tool and receive an ideology score that tells you, are you on the more extreme side of Twitter users or the less extreme side of Twitter users, according to the language that you use in your tweets. You can then compare that to your views, your real views, to see whether what I call the social media prism is creating these pervasive misperceptions that we think are really detrimental in creating this kind of false polarization. So we know at scale, even often before social media, that people were exaggerating the extent of polarization. This is, by the way, one of the reasons one of the things that motivated my earlier comment about how much we should worry about disinformation. I worry that if we make too big a deal out of it, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so one of the real things we know about intervening to reduce polarization is that correcting misperceptions is one of the most powerful things we can do to improve intergroup relations. There's a recent study run in 29 different countries that finds evidence of that. So this is a really powerful tool in our toolkit. The other thing we can do is try to incentivize better, more civil behavior. And so here you're looking at the Polarization Lab's social media bipartisanship leaderboard. So we track a very large number of politicians, journalists, advocacy groups, and we rate the extent to which their tweets become liked or approved by both Republicans and Democrats in the US. And the ratio of these two factors determines how far up they appear on our leaderboard. The idea here is to invert the status incentives of social media. Rather than incentivizing kind of status-seeking extremists, we want to incentivize people to gain status by reaching larger groups of people. And we think that at scale, this could be a real tool to help people overcome misperceptions. We build bots that retweet messages from people on these leaderboards and tools that identify conversations online where our analysis indicates that Republicans and Democrats are actually disagreeing. Because if you're like me, your common experience on social media is you log on, everybody seems heavily polarized. You don't see any consensus anywhere, and these tools are meant to help you try to do that. Okay, so because we think user behavior and human nature is powering some of our divisions, we want to move some of the conversation away from simply blaming social media platforms for our problem. There's a lot of blame to go around, but I think we haven't accepted the human element in driving in this status-seeking behavior that I think contributes so heavily. But of course, we need to consider top-down solutions as well and think about how the environments that we create online dictate the incentives for behavior. Can we create better spaces where people are rewarded for engaging in the kind of bridging or bonding behavior that Jennifer was talking about? Can we identify core features or characteristics of technology that can bring people together instead of pushing them apart? And so, of course, we would like to go to Facebook and Twitter and say, can we please run some studies where we profoundly change your platform and see what happens? And of course, the answer is no. The answer is no, because of the many public scandals that I think we're all familiar with, Cambridge Analytica and other recent controversies involving social media companies. So what we did in the Polarization Lab is we created a simulated social media platform that allows us to control different features of the technological environment. And then we pay people to use the platform in a series of experiments to try to isolate which features of the platform, which top-down features of the social environment can change behavior. We're in the first of 3 studies on this new platform. And this one we called Discuss It. We paid Republicans and Democrats to engage in conversations about either immigration or gun control. And we either told them that they were talking to someone from the other party, or didn't tell them they were talking to someone from the other party, or mislabeled the party of the person they were talking to try to see whether anonymity and various degrees of anonymity might improve the ability of people to compromise. Now, you might be saying, that's a terrible idea. Anonymous conversation on social media can be awful. People get harassed. People feel free to say anything. But the fact that people feel free to say anything is also, in some sense, an asset, because people are perhaps more comfortable exploring unpopular opinions with their own side. If we're in a public setting, and if you are, say, a liberal person in the US, you may feel constrained in talking about defunding the police or in other kinds of sensitive issues on your side, let alone the other side. And so anonymity, in other words, may allow us to explore unpopular solutions and also give us time for reflection, particularly if it's asynchronous, like often occurs on social media. And so when we randomize people into different versions of our social media platform, some of which were anonymous and some of which weren't anonymous, we were very surprised to discover that anonymous conversations depolarize both Republicans and Democrats, a substantial effect both for our opinions on issues like immigration and gun control, also in terms of our attitudes towards the other party. So it improved our affective or our judgment of the other party. A simple 1-hour conversation that unfolded entirely in an anonymous conversation online. And most intriguing to me is that the size of this effect was about 6 times larger for Republicans than for Democrats. In other words, when Republicans used this platform, they tended to depolarize 6 times more than Democrats, even though Democrats also depolarized, suggesting that perhaps the identity politics on the right, which has such a strong orthodoxy around which ideas are considered acceptable, taking people away from their own side may allow them to, again, give them the space to explore these kind of unpopular ideas. And I think I'm very close to time and very eager to hear your feedback. And thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor, Pete, to be here. Thank you.